March 6, 1944, Tempelhof Airfield, Berlin, Germany. Oberst Heinrich Wegener's hands trembled as he circled the wreckage before him, a downed P-38 Lightning, its twin booms twisted but largely intact, bearing the serial number 42 to 104023. His eyes fixed on two objects that should not exist. Two massive cylindrical tanks, each nearly 3 meters long, lying detached in the grass beside the fuselage. External fuel tanks. Drop tanks. Wegener calculated quickly, his engineering mind racing through fuel consumption rates and range mathematics. Each tank held approximately 1,100 liters, combined with internal fuel. His throat tightened. "Mein Gott," he whispered to no one. "They can reach anywhere in the Reich now. Anywhere." This was not supposed to be possible. Every assumption the Luftwaffe held about American fighter range, about the sanctity of German airspace beyond 600 kilometers, about the vulnerability of American bomber formations in the deep interior, all of it had just become obsolete, and the bombers that morning had proven it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The day had begun like dozens before it. At 0547 hours, Luftwaffe radar stations along the Dutch coast detected the familiar signature, a massive formation of American heavy bombers assembling over England. The 8th Air Force was coming again. Nothing unusual, nothing unexpected. Generalmajor Josef Schmid, commanding Jagdkorps I, responsible for the defense of northern Germany, received the initial reports in his command bunker beneath Berlin. The estimated formation size, approximately 700 heavy bombers, B-17 flying fortresses, and B-24 liberators. Target, likely Berlin, or one of the industrial centers in central Germany. Schmid had fought this battle many times. The Americans would penetrate German airspace, their fighter escorts P-47 Thunderbolts, and perhaps some P-51 Mustangs would accompany them to the limits of their range, somewhere around 600 kilometers from English bases. Then the escorts would turn back, their fuel exhausted, and then the Jagdwaffe, the German fighter force, would attack. The mathematics were simple and had held true for 2 years of daylight bombing campaigns. American fighters carried internal fuel loads that permitted roughly 90 minutes of combat operations at distance. Flying from English bases to targets in Western Germany consumed that fuel quickly. The deeper American bombers penetrated into the Reich, the more vulnerable they became as their escorts reached maximum range and turned for home. This fundamental limitation had shaped German defensive doctrine. Schmid positioned his Fightergruppen in depth across northern Germany. The forward units would engage American escorts, forcing them to burn fuel in combat. The deeper units would wait, knowing the escorts would depart and leave the bombers exposed. Then the real killing would begin. At 0612 hours, the American formation crossed the Dutch coast at Ijmuiden. Approximately 730 heavy bombers in combat boxes, stepped formations designed for mutual defensive fire. Radar operators counted fighter escorts the expected P-47 seconds, their distinctive radial engines visible even at altitude. Schmid ordered his forward Gruppen to engage. Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 11, Jagdgeschwader 3 more than 200, Bf 109 and FOW 190 fighters rose to meet the American formation. The engagement began over the Netherlands, exactly as planned. But something was different, something the German pilots reported immediately. The American escorts were not engaging as aggressively as usual. They remained close to the bomber formations, refusing to be drawn away into extended dogfights. They were conserving fuel, the German pilots realized, staying with their bombers longer than normal. At 0648 hours, the American formation crossed into German airspace northeast of Osnabrück. Schmid expected the fighter escorts to begin turning back. Their fuel should be exhausted. The mathematics permitted no other outcome. The P-47 Thunderbolts had a combat radius of approximately 450 kilometers with internal fuel. The distance from English bases to the German border exceeded 400 kilometers. Simple addition meant the escorts would turn back now. They did not turn back. At 0705 hours, the formation continued southeast, penetrating deeper into Germany. The escorts remained. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, leading 2, JG-1, reported sighting P-38 Lightnings among the escort fighters. The twin-boomed American fighters were less common than P-47 seconds, but not unknown. Lang noted their presence in his combat report and continued his attack approach. What Lang did not report, what he could not have known from visual observation at combat distances, was what those P-38 seconds carried. Beneath each wing, between the fuselage and the engine nacelles, hung large cylindrical tanks, external fuel tanks. Drop tanks that transformed the P-38 from a medium-range escort into a strategic weapon capable of penetrating to any target in Germany. At 0738 hours, the American bomber formation reached Berlin, 730 heavy bombers over the Reich capital, and their fighter escorts were still with them. After more than 900 kilometers of flight from English bases, after crossing the entire Netherlands and northern Germany, the American fighters remained in formation, protecting their bombers over the target itself. Schmid received the reports with disbelief. Impossible. The fuel calculations did not permit this. No American fighter had the range to escort bombers to Berlin and return to England. The mathematics were absolute. Yet, the reports continued. P-38 seconds engaging German fighters over Berlin, P-47 seconds making firing passes on German interceptors above the city. American escorts still present, still operational, still protecting their bombers over the most heavily defended target in Germany. The bombing run lasted 18 minutes. American bombers struck the Erkner ball-bearing plant, the Daimler-Benz tank engine factory, and the Robert Bosch electrical equipment facility. German flak batteries threw up thousands of rounds. Luftwaffe fighters pressed attacks despite the American escort presence. But the escorts remained, driving off attack after attack, maintaining their protective formation around the bomber stream. At 0811 hours, the American formation turned west, beginning the long flight back to England, and the escorts turned with them, still present, still protecting, still defying every calculation that German intelligence had made about American fighter capabilities. By 0850 hours, the truth became undeniable. The escorts were not only reaching Berlin, they were going to make it home. German fighter pilots reported watching American P-38 seconds and P-47 seconds, escorting the bomber stream all the way back across northern Germany, across the Netherlands, out over the North Sea toward England. The bomber losses for the mission would prove minimal. Of 730 heavy bombers dispatched, fewer than 70 were lost, a loss rate of less than 10%. Without effective escort, German fighters routinely inflicted losses exceeding 20% on deep penetration raids. The presence of American fighters over the target had cut German effectiveness by more than half. But the bomber losses were not what occupied Schmid's thoughts as he reviewed the mission reports that afternoon. What consumed his attention was a single question that had no answer. The answer to Schmid's question lay in the wreckage of P-38J15LO serial number 42-104023, piloted by 2nd Lieutenant Robert Harmon of the 55th Fighter Group, 338th Fighter Squadron. Harmon's aircraft had been hit by flak over Berlin during the morning mission. Shell fragments had damaged the port engine and severed hydraulic lines. The Lightning could fly on one engine, but battle damage was extensive. Harmon attempted to nurse the aircraft back toward Allied lines, but the damaged engine eventually failed completely over Brandenburg. At approximately 0845 hours, Harmon bailed out. He was captured by Wehrmacht troops within the hour. His aircraft, however, remained largely intact. The Lightning struck the ground in a relatively flat glide, its structural integrity preserved despite the crash. By 1100 hours, Wehrmacht recovery crews had located the wreck. By 1300 hours, Luftwaffe technical intelligence officers were on site. Oberst Heinrich Wegener arrived at Tempelhof Airfield at 1620 hours. Wegener commanded Abteilung Ich, the technical intelligence section of Luftwaffe operations staff. A pre-war aeronautical engineer from Messerschmitt, Wegener's expertise in aircraft design made him invaluable for analyzing captured enemy aircraft. He had examined dozens of American aircraft P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators. He understood their strengths and limitations. He had calculated their performance envelopes and operational capabilities. He had advised German fighter commanders on optimal tactics for engaging each type, but nothing in his experience prepared him for what he found beside Harman's crashed P-38. The external fuel tanks, 2 of them, each massive, had detached during the crash and lay in the grass approximately 20 meters from the main wreckage. Wegener approached them slowly, his mind already calculating dimensions and capacity. Each tank was constructed of pressed paper and glue, reinforced with thin metal bands. The construction was crude, almost primitive. The tanks were clearly expendable, designed to be jettisoned once empty, falling away to reduce drag and weight. But their size, Wegener pulled out his measuring tape. Length, 2.84 meters. Diameter, 0.76 meters. He calculated the volume, approximately 1,100 liters per tank. 2 tanks meant 2,200 liters of additional fuel beyond the P-38's internal capacity. Wegener walked to the crashed Lightning and climbed into the cockpit. The fuel gauge showed the internal tanks were nearly empty, exactly what one would expect after a mission to Berlin and attempted return flight. He examined the fuel system, tracing the lines from the external tank mounting points to the main fuel distribution manifold. The system was elegant in its simplicity. The external tanks fed through direct lines to the main tanks. The pilot could select which tanks to draw from using a simple fuel selector valve. External tanks would be used first, consumed during the cruise to target. Once empty, they would be jettisoned, dropped away to fall harmlessly to earth below. The aircraft would then rely on internal fuel for combat and return flight. The implications crystallized in Wegener's mind with terrible clarity. The P-38J had an internal fuel capacity of approximately 1,590 liters. With 2 1,100-liter external tanks, total capacity reached 3,790 liters. The P-38's Allison V-1000 710 engines consumed approximately 550 liters per hour in cruise configuration. Total fuel gave the aircraft roughly 7 hours of endurance. 7 hours. The flight from English bases to Berlin took approximately 2 hours. Combat operations over target might last 30 minutes. Return flight another 2 hours. Total mission time, 4.5 to 5 hours. The P-38 with external tanks had fuel reserves exceeding mission requirements by more than 2 hours. But it was worse than that. Much worse. Wegener retrieved the technical manuals captured from the wreck, American flight manuals, maintenance documents, mission planning materials. He spent the next 4 hours reading every page, cross-referencing specifications, calculating performance envelopes. The P-38 was not unique. The documents referenced external tank configurations for multiple American fighter types. P-47 Thunderbolts could carry a single 757-liter belly tank. P-51 Mustangs could carry 2 416-liter wing tanks plus a 568-liter belly tank. Every American fighter type was being equipped with external fuel capacity that transformed its operational range. The Americans were not just extending their fighters' range incrementally, they were doubling it, tripling it in some cases. They were creating strategic escort fighters capable of accompanying bombers to any target in Germany and returning to England. Wegener sat in the growing darkness beside Harman's wrecked P-38, surrounded by technical documents and calculations scrawled on notepaper. The mathematics were irrefutable, the implications were catastrophic. The entire German defensive strategy, the strategy of trading space for time, of allowing American bombers to penetrate deep into Germany, where they would be vulnerable without escorts, that entire strategy had just become obsolete. The sanctuaries in central and southern Germany, the industrial centres in Bavaria and Saxony that had been effectively immune to American daylight raids due to distance, all were now vulnerable. American fighters could now reach anywhere in the Reich. Anywhere. Every aircraft factory, every synthetic oil refinery, every ball-bearing plant, every transportation hub, all within range of American escort fighters. The strategic depth that Germany depended on for protection had vanished. The Americans had collapsed space itself through the simple expedient of adding external fuel tanks to their fighters. At 2,115 hours, Wegener finally stood and walked back to his staff car. His driver, seeing his commander's expression, asked no questions. They drove through darkened Berlin streets back to Luftwaffe operations headquarters. Wegener would spend the entire night writing his report, the report that would inform German High Command that the air war over Europe had fundamentally changed. The report that would explain why American bomber losses had suddenly dropped. The report that would reveal that German fighters would now face American escorts over every target, no matter how deep into the Reich. The report that would confirm Germany was losing the air war. What Wegener could not fully appreciate, what no single German officer could comprehend from examining one crashed aircraft, was the scale of the transformation occurring across American fighter forces in England. The drop tank program had not emerged suddenly. It had developed gradually, almost invisibly, over more than a year. But its acceleration in late 1943 and early 1944 represented one of the most significant technological deployments of the entire air war, a deployment that had somehow escaped German intelligence attention until it was too late. The program's origins reached back to 1942, when American commanders first confronted the brutal mathematics of bomber escort over Europe. The P-37 Thunderbolt, entering service in late 1942, had excellent performance and heavy armament, but its combat radius of 450 kilometers meant it could barely reach the German border from English bases. Bombers attacking targets in central Germany flew hundreds of kilometers without fighter protection. The solution seemed obvious: external fuel tanks, but implementation proved far more complex than theory suggested. Metal tanks were heavy and consumed valuable resources. They required complex manufacturing and competed with aircraft production for materials and factory capacity. Initial experiments with metal tanks showed promise, but could not scale to meet operational requirements. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source: paper. Engineers at the Royal Air Force's Technical Development Unit had experimented with compressed paper fuel tanks for British fighters. The concept was simple: layers of paper pulp, pressed together with waterproof glue, reinforced with metal bands. The resulting tanks were light, cheap, and required minimal strategic materials. They could be manufactured in virtually any facility with basic industrial capacity. American engineers adapted the British concept, creating standardized drop tank designs for each American fighter type. The tanks were crude, they leaked slightly, they deteriorated over time if not used, they were fragile in handling, but they worked. And they could be produced in enormous quantities. By October 1943, production of paper drop tanks in England reached 25,000 units per month. By January 1944, production exceeded 50,000 units per month. By March 1944, the month of Harman's crash and Wegener's discovery production approached 75,000 units per month. Every American fighter mission over Europe now launched with external tanks as standard equipment. The scale of this transformation is difficult to overstate. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force flew approximately 25 major bomber missions. Each mission involved hundreds of heavy bombers and hundreds of escort fighters. Each escort fighter carried external tanks, often multiple tanks. In a single month, American forces consumed tens of thousands of drop tanks, each one extending American striking power deeper into Germany. and German intelligence had missed it completely. The tanks were jettisoned before major combat began. They fell away over the Netherlands, over Belgium, over Western Germany, far from areas where German intelligence could recover and examine them. The few that were recovered intact attracted little attention. They were crude, primitive-looking objects that seemed tactically insignificant compared to aircraft themselves. German intelligence focused on tracking American fighter production, identifying new aircraft types, analyzing engine performance and armament. They counted P-47 groups and P-51 squadrons deploying to England. They tracked the arrival of new aircraft and the expansion of American fighter strength. What they failed to recognize was that the aircraft they were counting had doubled their range through a technology so simple it seemed beneath serious intelligence attention. Paper tanks, expendable cylinders of pressed pulp and glue. The invisible revolution that collapsed German strategic depth and made every target in the Reich vulnerable to American daylight bombing with fighter escort. Wegener understood all of this as he completed his report in the early hours of March 7th. He understood that what he was documenting was not just a tactical development but a strategic transformation. The air war had changed fundamentally, and Germany had no answer. The Luftwaffe could not stop American bombers when they were protected by escorts. German fighters were effective against unescorted bombers, but suffered heavy losses when engaging through American fighter screens. The entire German defensive concept, destroy the bombers, despite losses in fighter strength, depended on catching the bombers without escorts. Now, there would be no bombers without escorts. Not over Berlin, not over Munich, not over the synthetic oil refineries in Saxony, not over the aircraft, factories in Bavaria. Everywhere the bombers went, American fighters would go with them, and the Luftwaffe lacked the strength to defeat both simultaneously. At 0620 hours on March 7th, Wegener submitted his report to General Oberst Heinrich Wegener, Chief of the Luftwaffe General Staff. The report was 47 pages, including technical drawings, fuel consumption calculations, and range diagrams showing the operational radius of American fighters with external tanks. The final paragraph read, "The introduction of large-capacity external fuel tanks on American fighter aircraft has eliminated the range advantage that German defensive doctrine depends upon. American fighters can now escort bomber formations to any target in Germany. Our defensive strategy of allowing bombers to penetrate beyond escort range before engaging is no longer viable. We must develop new tactics immediately, or accept that we can no longer prevent American daylight bombing of any target within the Reich." Jeschonek. Read the report that morning. He read it again that afternoon. At 1800 hours, he ordered Wegener to brief senior Luftwaffe commanders at an emergency conference scheduled for March 9th. The air war had changed, and Germany was on the wrong side of that change. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. March 9th, 1944. Luftwaffe High Command Headquarters, Wildpark Werder, near Potsdam. The conference room fell silent as Oberst Heinrich Wegener placed the external fuel tank recovered intact from a P-47 that crashed near Hanover on the oak table before Germany's senior fighter commanders. 23 officers stared at the cylindrical object. Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, General der Jagdflieger, reached forward and lifted it. The tank was surprisingly light, barely 15 kilograms empty. He examined the construction layers of compressed paper, metal reinforcement bands, crude but functional fittings for fuel lines. "Paper," Galland said quietly. "They are defeating us with pressed paper and glue." Wegener spent the next 90 minutes presenting his analysis. He showed range calculations, fuel consumption data, operational radius charts. He explained how the Americans had solved the escort problem not through advanced engineering, but through mass production of expendable fuel containers. He demonstrated that every target in Germany was now within range of American fighter escort. The commanders listened in silence. Some took notes. Others simply stared at the maps showing concentric circles extending from English bases, circles that now encompassed Berlin, Munich, Dresden, every industrial centre in the Reich. When Wegener finished, Galland spoke first. "How many of these tanks are the Americans producing?" "Our best estimate, Herr General, is between 60,000 and 80,000 per month across all types." The number hung in the air. Someone coughed. No one else spoke. General Major Dietrich Peltz, commanding 2 Jagdkorps, broke the silence. "We must destroy their production facilities, bomb the factories producing these tanks." Galland's response was immediate and cutting. "With what, Dietrich? We have no strategic bombers remaining. The Americans destroyed them over England in 1940. We have no aircraft that can reach England with meaningful bomb loads. We have no way to strike their production." "Then we must develop countermeasures," Oberst Johannes Steinhoff suggested. "Tactics that allow us to engage bombers despite escort presence." "We have tried," Galland replied. "Every tactic we develop, the Americans counter. We concentrate against one section of the bomber stream, they concentrate escorts there. We attack from high altitude, they climb to meet us. We attack from low altitude, they dive on us. We attempt to draw escorts away, they refuse to chase us. Their discipline is excellent. Their numbers are overwhelming. Their tactics are sound." Wegener watched the discussion continue for another hour. Suggestions were made. Each was examined. Each was found inadequate. The fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The Luftwaffe lacked the numerical strength to defeat both American bombers and their escorts simultaneously. At 1,445 hours, General Oberst Schmid entered the conference room. All officers stood. Schmid had read Wegener's report. He had reviewed the calculations. He had consulted with Reich Minister of Armaments Albert Speer about German production capacity and strategic vulnerabilities. He had briefed Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, who had promised to brief Hitler personally. Schmid got directly to the point. "Gentlemen, the Führer has ordered that German fighter production be increased immediately. All resources will be directed toward producing fighters. Bomber production will be reduced. Transport production will be reduced. Only fighters matter. Now." The announcement should have been encouraging. More fighters meant more capability to defend the Reich, but every officer in the room understood the subtext. The order acknowledged that Germany had lost the initiative. Germany was now reacting to American capabilities, responding defensively, abandoning offensive operations entirely. Galland asked the question everyone was thinking. "Herr General, what is our production target? 3,000 fighters per month by July, 5,000 per month by September." The numbers were staggering. Current production ran approximately 1,200 fighters per month. Tripling production in 4 months would require massive industrial reorganization. Quadrupling it would require miracles. But even if achieved, the numbers revealed how desperate Germany's situation had become. To match American fighter production, which exceeded 4,000 aircraft per month and was still increasing, Germany would need to sacrifice production of virtually every other aircraft type. And even then, Germany would barely achieve parity in numbers while remaining inferior in pilot training, fuel availability, and operational experience. The conference ended at 1,620 hours with no solutions, only orders to fight on with whatever resources could be provided. The commanders departed in silence. Wegener remained, gathering his documents and the drop tank sample. Galland approached him as the room emptied. "Your report was excellent, Oberst. Thorough, detailed, accurate. It will change nothing." Wegener met Galland's eyes. "I know, Herr General. We will continue fighting. We will shoot down American bombers and fighters. We will inflict casualties. But we cannot stop them." Galland paused. "The Americans have solved the fundamental problem of strategic bombing. They can now deliver overwhelming force anywhere they choose, protected by escorts we cannot defeat. The war is lost." Galland left without waiting for a response. Wegener stood alone in the empty conference room, holding a paper fuel tank that weighed less than a rifle, but had collapsed Germany's aerial defense strategy more effectively than any weapon. What followed the March 9th conference was not surrender, but a brutal arithmetic of attrition that consumed the Luftwaffe through the spring and summer of 1944. The statistics tell a story of systematic destruction more effectively than any narrative. March 1944. 8th Air Force flew 25 major missions against German targets. Average bomber loss rate, 3.9%, down from 6.8% in January before widespread drop tank deployment. Luftwaffe fighter loss, 489 aircraft destroyed, 167 pilotes killed. April 1944, 26 major missions. Average bomber loss rate, 3,2%. Luftwaffe losses. 536 fighters destroyed, 298 pilots killed. May 1944, 32 major missions. Average bomber loss rate, 2.8%. Luftwaffe losses, 612 fighters destroyed, 341 pilots killed. The pattern was clear and irreversible. As American escort capability increased, bomber losses decreased while German fighter losses accelerated. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than training programs could replace them. Worse, the quality of replacement pilots declined steadily as training time was compressed to meet urgent operational demands. In 1942, a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot received approximately 240 hours of training before joining an operational unit. By mid-1944, training time had dropped to 120 hours, barely half the previous standard. American pilots received 350 to 400 hours of training before deploying to Europe. The experience gap translated directly into combat effectiveness. Hauptmann Franz Stigler, an ace with 28 victories, described the situation in his diary entry from May 18, 1944. They send us boys who have barely learned to fly. Yesterday we received 6 replacement pilots. The oldest is 19. They have 110 hours total flight time. Half of that is basic flight training. They have 20 hours in the Bf 109, maybe 25. No gunnery. Training. No formation flying experience. No combat tactics instruction. We are supposed to send them against American fighters flown by pilots with hundreds of combat missions. It is murder. We are murdering our own young men by sending them to fight when they have no chance of survival. The diary entry was not exaggeration. In May 1944, average survival time for a new Luftwaffe fighter pilot was 14 operational missions. The Americans called inexperienced German pilots snappers, easy targets that could be shot down with minimal effort. American pilots racked up multiple kills per mission against these inadequately trained replacements. Meanwhile, American escort tactics evolved to exploit German weaknesses systematically. The drop tanks enabled new operational concepts that German defenders struggled to counter. Freelance hunting became standard practice. Once bombers crossed into German airspace, some escort groups would drop their external tanks and range ahead of the bomber. Stream, hunting for German fighters before they could assemble for attack. These ranging fighters, called rat racing by pilots, would bounce Luftwaffe formations as they climbed toward the bombers, scattering them and forcing them to fight before reaching attack positions. Target area patrol placed fighter groups directly over targets, circling at various altitudes to intercept any German fighters attempting to attack bombers during their bombing runs. German fighters had to fight through these patrols to reach bombers, and the patrols were positioned at ideal altitude and speed for engagement. Withdrawal support provided fresh escort fighters to meet bomber streams as they departed target areas, when bomber crews were exhausted and German fighters often massed for final attacks. The arriving escorts, having consumed external fuel during transit, would drop tanks over Germany and have full internal fuel for extended combat during the withdrawal phase. Every tactic exploited the range advantage that drop tanks provided. German fighters, operating from bases within Germany, could reach combat zones quickly, but had limited endurance once there. American fighters could cruise on external fuel, arrive with full internal fuel remaining, drop external tanks when combat began, and fight with fuel reserves that exceeded German capabilities. The strategic implications became apparent in June 1944 during Big Week, a concentrated series of missions targeting German aircraft production facilities. Over 6 days, 8th Air Force dispatched nearly 4,000 bomber sorties against Messerschmitt, Focke-Wulf, and Junkers factories across Germany. Every mission flew with full fighter escort, from takeoff to target to landing. German defenders scrambled every available fighter. Luftwaffe units across Germany and occupied territories launched interception missions continuously, throwing everything they had against the American formations. The result was catastrophic for German fighter forces. The 6-day campaign cost the Luftwaffe 692 fighters destroyed and 289 pilots killed, more than one-third of total German fighter strength on the Western Front. American losses totaled 137 bombers and 28 fighters, serious but sustainable given American production capacity. The exchange rate, 25 German fighters lost for every American fighter lost, was mathematically unsustainable for Germany. Worse for German forces, the bombing achieved its objective. Aircraft production facilities suffered significant damage. Messerschmitt's Regensburg plant lost 30% capacity. Focke-Wulf's Bremen facility was severely damaged. Even accounting for Germany's impressive ability to disperse production and restore damaged facilities, the attacks set back fighter production by approximately 6 weeks, precisely when Germany needed maximum production to replace mounting losses. Albert Speer, examining damage reports after Big Week, wrote to Hitler, "The enemy has demonstrated the ability to strike our aircraft industry with impunity. Despite determined defense by our fighter forces, the enemy bomber formations reached every targeted facility and inflicted substantial damage. Our fighter losses during these defensive operations were severe. If such attacks continue at this intensity, we cannot sustain current fighter strength regardless of production increases." The attacks continued. Through June, July, and August, American bomber formations struck German targets with increasing frequency. Synthetic oil refineries critical for fuel production came under sustained attack. Transportation networks were systematically disrupted. Ball-bearing plants, electrical equipment factories, chemical facilities, all were hit repeatedly. And every mission flew with complete fighter escort. The Luftwaffe could contest these missions. It could inflict casualties, but it could not prevent them, and every mission cost Germany more fighters and pilots than it could afford to lose. What makes the drop tank story particularly bitter for German forces is that Germany had possessed the same technology and rejected it. In 1941, Messerschmitt engineers developed external fuel tanks for the Bf 109 fighter. The tanks were tested extensively and proved effective, increasing the Bf 109's range by approximately 50%. The technology was available, proven, and ready for mass production, but Luftwaffe High Command rejected widespread deployment. The reasoning reflected the offensive mindset that dominated German military thinking in 1941 to 1942. Germany was winning. German forces were advancing. German fighters operated from captured airfields close to combat zones. Why burden fighters with external tanks that reduced performance and required additional logistics when airfields could simply be captured closer to where they were needed? The few Bf 109 seconds equipped with drop tanks were used primarily for ferry flights, moving aircraft between distant bases rather than combat operations. The technology existed but was dismissed as unnecessary for Germany's tactical situation. By the time German commanders recognized the value of extended range, by the time they understood that defensive operations required fighters to patrol large areas for extended periods, American forces had already deployed drop tanks at scale. Germany attempted to catch up in late 1943, introducing drop tank production programs for both Bf 109 and Fw 190 fighters. But Germany's production capacity could not match American output. German factories produced approximately 8,000 drop tanks per month by mid-1944, compared to American production exceeding 75,000 per month. The disparity in scale meant that while some German fighters flew with external tanks, the capability could not be deployed consistently across all units. More critically, German fighters flying defensive missions within Germany often did not need extended range. They operated from bases within the areas they were defending. The problem was not range, but numbers and pilot quality. Drop tanks could not solve those fundamental deficiencies. Oberleutnant Heinz Nock, a fighter pilot who survived the war with 33 victories, reflected on this in post-war interviews. "We had the same technology. We understood the concept. But we never imagined the Americans would produce those tanks by the tens of thousands, that they would make them disposable and cheap enough to use once and throw away. We thought in terms of metal tanks, expensive and reusable. They thought in terms of paper tanks, nearly free and expendable. That difference in thinking, that willingness to mass-produce simple solutions, that was why they won and we lost." By September 1944, the air war over Europe had effectively ended as a contest. The Luftwaffe still existed. Fighters still scrambled to intercept American formations. Pilots still fought with courage and determination. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. American bomber formations flew to targets across Germany with minimal losses. The massive raids that characterized early 1944 raids with hundreds of bombers gave way to routine missions that received barely any mention in newspapers. Bombing Germany became ordinary, unremarkable, a daily occurrence that no longer warranted special attention. The 8th Air Force statistics for September 1944 tell the story completely. 27 major missions dispatched, 7,989 bomber sorties. 53 bombers lost a loss rate of 0.66%. At this loss rate, a bomber crew could expect to survive more than 150 missions. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a nuisance rather than a threat. German fighter production did reach Jeschonek's targets. In July 1944, production exceeded 3,100 fighters. In September, production reached 3,375 fighters. These numbers represented remarkable industrial achievement under sustained bombing pressure. Albert Speer's reorganization of production, the dispersal of facilities, the use of underground factories, all these measures succeeded in maintaining fighter production despite American attacks. But the aircraft rolled out of factories faster than they could be crewed by qualified pilots. Training losses exceeded combat losses as inexperienced pilots crashed during basic flight operations. Fuel shortages forced reductions in training hours, which increased accident rates, which required more replacement pilots who received even less training. The cycle was self-reinforcing and unsolvable given Germany's shrinking resource base. By October 1944, operational Luftwaffe fighter strength on the Western Front numbered approximately 1,400 aircraft, roughly the same as 6 months earlier, despite thousands of new aircraft delivered. The attrition of experienced pilots meant that most units operated at 60 to 70% of authorized strength. Those aircraft that were operational often could not fly due to fuel shortages. Those that could fly were increasingly crewed by pilots with minimal experience, facing American pilots with hundreds of combat hours. The last major Luftwaffe operation against American daylight bombers came on January 1st, 1945, Operation Bodenplatte. The operation targeted Allied airfields in Belgium and the Netherlands, attempting to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and regain air superiority during the Battle of the Bulge. Nearly 900 German fighters launched in the largest Luftwaffe operation of the war's final year. The operation achieved tactical surprise and destroyed approximately 150 Allied aircraft on the ground. But German losses exceeded 270 fighters, including more than 200 pilots killed or captured. Many of the pilots lost were experienced formation leaders and instructor pilots, men the Luftwaffe could not afford to lose under any circumstances. The operation gained nothing strategically while consuming irreplaceable resources. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe essentially ceased offensive operations. Fighters were husbanded for defense of the Reich itself, as Allied armies advanced from all directions. The few missions flown against Allied bombers achieved nothing beyond individual pilot heroics that changed no strategic calculations. Second Lieutenant Robert Harmon, the P-38 pilot whose crash provided Oberst Wegener's revelation, survived the war in a German prisoner of war camp. He was liberated by Soviet forces in April 1945 and returned to the United States in June. In a post-war interview, he was asked about the drop tanks that extended his fighter's range. "We didn't think much about them," Harmon said. "They were just part of the equipment. You'd load them before the mission, fly with them to the combat area, drop them when you needed to fight or when they were empty. Simple, practical. They let us go wherever the bombers went. Without them, we couldn't have done our job. With them, we could reach anywhere in Germany. That made all the difference." The simplicity of Harmon's description captures the essential nature of the drop tank revolution. There was no advanced technology involved, no exotic materials, no engineering breakthroughs, just paper cylinders filled with fuel that could be mass-produced cheaply and used once before being discarded. The innovation was not in the technology, but in the willingness to produce it at scale and deploy it as standard equipment. American industrial capacity made this possible. The same factories that produced paper drop tanks could have produced more sophisticated metal tanks, but metal tanks required strategic materials and complex manufacturing. Paper tanks required only pulp, glue, and basic industrial processes. They could be manufactured in facilities that otherwise contributed nothing to war production. They could be produced in quantities that made them truly expendable. This approach, mass-producing simple solutions rather than perfecting complex ones, characterized American industrial strategy throughout the war. It stood in stark contrast to German approaches that emphasized quality and sophistication over quantity and simplicity. Germany produced superior tanks that were complex to manufacture and maintain. America produced adequate tanks that could be manufactured by the tens of thousands. Germany produced sophisticated aircraft with excellent performance. America produced adequate aircraft in overwhelming numbers. The drop tank exemplified this philosophy perfectly. A paper cylinder that leaked, deteriorated in storage, and was too fragile for rough handling, but could be produced by the millions, and transformed American fighters into strategic weapons that collapsed German defensive depth. Oberst Heinrich Wegener survived the war and returned to aeronautical engineering in post-war Germany. In the 1,950 seconds, he worked on early jet aircraft development. In a 1963 interview, he was asked about his March 1944 report on American drop tanks. "I knew immediately what it meant," Wegener said. "The mathematics were simple. The implications were obvious. I wrote the report hoping that somehow we could develop a response, some way to counter this capability. But there was no response. You cannot counter overwhelming numbers deployed with sound tactics. The Americans had solved the fundamental problem of strategic bombing, how to protect bombers throughout their entire mission. Once they solved that, the outcome was inevitable. We could fight, we could inflict casualties, but we could not win. The drop tanks made that certain. The interview took place in 1963, nearly 20 years after the war ended. The interviewer noted that Wegener still had the calculations he had made in March 1944, preserved in a personal notebook. Fuel consumption rates, operational radius calculations, time-distance equations, all still legible, all still accurate. "I kept them as a reminder," Wegener explained. "A reminder that wars are won not by the most sophisticated technology, but by the side that can deploy adequate technology in overwhelming quantity." The Americans understood this. We did not. That was why they won and we lost. The final accounting of the drop tank's impact on the air war over Europe is written in comparative statistics that reveal the transformation with mathematical clarity. January-March 1944, before widespread drop tank deployment. 8th Air Force bomber loss rate averaged 5.8% per mission. Average penetration depth of escorted missions, 480 kilometers from English bases. Number of German targets beyond effective escort range, 87 major industrial facilities. Luftwaffe fighter losses, 1,247 aircraft. July-September 1,944 after universal drop tank deployment. 8th Air Force bomber loss rate averaged 1.2% per mission. Average penetration depth of escorted missions, 1,100 kilometers from English bases sufficient to reach any target in Germany. Number of German targets beyond effective escort range, 0. Luftwaffe fighter losses, 2,438 aircraft. The bomber loss rate decreased by 79%. The area accessible to escorted raids more than doubled. The Luftwaffe lost twice as many fighters attempting to defend against missions that penetrated more than twice as deep into Germany, while suffering less than 1/4 the bomber casualties they inflicted 6 months earlier. Those numbers, more than any narrative, tell the complete story. The drop tank did not win the air war alone. No single technology ever does. But it transformed the strategic equation in ways that made German defense mathematically impossible. Once American bombers could fly anywhere in Germany with full fighter escort, the outcome was determined. Everything that followed was simply the working out of that fundamental reality. The paper cylinders that Oberst Wegener examined in March 1944, those crude pressed pulp tanks that seemed almost primitive compared to the sophisticated aircraft they served, proved to be among the most strategically significant technologies of the entire war, not because they represented advanced engineering, but because they represented industrial capacity deployed at scale toward a clearly understood objective. Lieutenant Harmon was correct. The tanks were simple, practical equipment that let American fighters go wherever bombers went. That capability escorts anywhere, always was what defeated the Luftwaffe, and ensured that American strategic bombing could continue without prohibitive losses until Germany surrendered. In the end, the Luftwaffe never expected P-38 drop tanks would bring escorts 1,300 miles deep into the Reich. When they discovered the truth, it was already too late to matter. The paper revolution had already won. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now. And don't forget to subscribe.